All right. Well, welcome to the session, the Undermaintained Building at the Gazette's Iowa Ideas Conference. I am your moderator, Sarah Conrad Baranowski. I am managing editor here at the Gazette. This session is within our economic development track, and I'd first like to recognize and thank the Iowa Ideas Conference sponsor, ITC Midwest, for making this conference possible. During our time together today, we'll talk with our panelists and address audience questions. If you have a question, if you're watching this and you have a question for one of our panelists or all of them, you can type it in the Q&A box and our tech host will forward it to me and I'll try to get to those before the session is over. So this session is being recorded and closed captioning is available. If you have any tech questions during the session, you can put those in the chat box and our tech host will try to help you figure out the technology woes that plague all of us from time to time. So now let's get started. I'm joined today by three panelists. They are Steve Beck, City Administrator in Belle Plaine, Jim Tomatich of Tomatich Engineering, and Jim Hammond, who owns a restored building in downtown Iowa Falls. So I want to start this off by giving each of them a chance to introduce themselves and tell us how they're connected to this issue of unmaintained or under-maintained buildings in Iowa. Jim Tomatich, let's start with you.
Sure. Yes, I'm a structural engineer, and we kind of specialize in a lot of different areas, one of them being historic restoration. We get business from people that are going to buy the building. We get business from the cities that are trying to do something with buildings. And we also get business from the insurance companies that are with failures of buildings. And so that's where Tomatich Engineering gets involved. There's obviously quite a few buildings around the state. And so we've done about 3,000 or 4,000. As far as historic restorations, we've probably done 500. And so there's and as far as insurance investigation goes, we've done 2,000 to 3,000. So just some of them are just inspections to see if people can restore the buildings.
All right. Steve Beck, how about you? Would you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Stephen Beck. I'm the city administrator in Belle Plaine. I've been the city administrator here since late 2019. And our small town has a lot of, we have a Main Street, and we had done a Main Street renovation about 10 years ago, and we're looking to maybe do a phase 2. We have a few older buildings that are on the brink of what they could go one way or another. And so we're going to talk about how we're going to make those decisions. And I'm not sure what else to add at the moment, but I appreciate being here, and thanks for everybody for coming.
Yeah. All right. And Jim Hammond, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Jim Hammond. I live in Iowa Falls, and back in 2013, we had a downtown building that was in danger of being demolished. I didn't want to see that happen because I retired here partially because of the wonderful old downtown street and commercial area. And so I went to the city manager and said, can I be of help? And he said yes. And I ended up purchasing the building and rehabbing it with lots of help from lots of people. And we'll get into that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's jump into some of my questions. Jim Tomatich, I wanted to start with you. Can you put the issue of under-maintained buildings or deteriorating buildings into context? Because, you threw out some numbers in your introduction, but how many towns are dealing with buildings like that? How widespread is this issue?
Pretty much it's every town that has a county seat, or every county that has a county seat. Typically, they would build a courthouse in the middle of the town, and then they would build the buildings around the perimeter. And most of this happened in the late 1800s, early 1900s. It seemed like that was pretty consistent. Although there are numerous buildings from the 1860s through, I've done as old a building of 1840. But anyway, most of what we're talking about in general today are small towns that have buildings around the square. And typically there's about 10 buildings per side, and there's typically 4 sides. So that's 40 buildings times about 100 counties. So that's about 40,000 buildings, plus all of the other historic buildings in towns, and places like Dubuque and Davenport have quite a few older buildings because they were river towns and they got built up before some of the other ones west of the Mississippi. So there's quite a few buildings. They were all built with what we refer to as common walls, meaning they were built one against the other. And there's some very common details of those, and we can discuss those later. But a lot of them are basically 100 years old now, and that's about the length that a masonry building, an unreinforced masonry building, can last. And quite often the roofs were not maintained. Water gets into the walls, the deterioration happens from the inside out, and therein lies the problem.
Yeah. So Steve, I wanted to switch to you because you, as a city administrator, you've seen some of these issues. I think I saw you nodding along there, but can you talk about some of the issues that Belle Plaine is faced with its buildings? I understand you have a few different buildings that you've either dealt with or are dealing with now or may have to in the future.
Yes. Can everybody hear me okay? My audio coming through?
That's
right.
Great.
So I'll start with what I would say is a success story. We have a historic theater called the King Theater. It was built in 1930. It has been fully operational for 93 years straight, with the exception of the majority of this year. And so it had sat empty for about a year. And I've been in there. It's been purchased, and the new owners are actively cleaning it up and getting the HVAC turned back on, and getting the air circulating, and getting the water out of the basement, and doing some really critical maintenance. And we're going to be able to open it up to a certain degree this fall. But just being unutilized for 1 year approximately, the amount of degradation that happened in that is just astounding. And, you know, growth and a number of things, fluorescence coming through the walls that wasn't there, just the mustiness in general. But it doesn't take long for these things to start going south. So I'm happy to talk about that one. So stay tuned on that one. Then we have the Chicago Northwestern Depot. It's a 2-story masonry building that was built in 1895. It burnt down the year that it was built, and they rebuilt it by the end of the same year at a cost of $12 million in today's money in 1895. And that thing's been sitting empty for about 20 years. But we had a guy come in at one point and put a new roof on it and tuck point it. So it's been weather tight for about 20 years. But now we have someone coming in to renovate that thing. It has great bones. Our problem child in the town, the one that has been plaguing the city for about 2 decades, is the Herring Hotel. And it was originally a large manor house that was a bed and breakfast right on the Lincoln Highway and the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. And at one point, a gentleman bought it and kind of boomtown slapped together 2x4 construction into a 3-story hotel constructed out of 2x4s and then wrapped in brick facade masonry, really thin stuff, poorly executed. The only reason it's standing is because every room in it is about 12 by 10. So it's kind of like a little beehive. It withstood the derecho, but the roof is bad. It is a habitat for several different species of critters, and it's full of lead paint and ACM, or asbestos containing materials. With the state of degradation that it's in, we have to treat the entire building like one big piece of asbestos, essentially, because it cannot be mitigated out. So that one is a 0 lot line, meaning there is no elbow room to work around it. Fortunately, the other buildings around it have been raised, but it's going to be a heavy lift, and it's right next to a highway and other things. And How much more do you want me to expound on that? Or
So is this, the city owns the building now? Is that right?
yes, it was owned by a family, and I was actually on the board for a while for their group and trying to help them get historic tax credits or any number of things. And that was at a time where, you know, brownfield, grayfield, and some historic tax credits were about the only thing. The state has rolled out in the last few years more upper story living grants and things like that, but those weren't available back at the time. So the building just kept deteriorating and deteriorating, to the point where it's a 3-story 2x4 building, and it's just not feasible to fix it. It's not even up to code in any manner of the speaking, and it's just going to have to hit the ground, unfortunately. And there's mixed feelings about it in town, and but the city had to acquire it via what's called a 657A. So it's through the county, through the court system, and it takes a long time. The building has to be empty for 6 months. There are other criteria, and then there's a cooling off period, and it takes quite a while. It takes almost a year to do a 657A sometimes in a rural community. But now the city has it, and we're making a plan.
All right. Well, Jim Hammond, that gives me kind of an opening to go to you, because Iowa Falls had a building kind of that was headed sort of in that direction. Can you talk a little bit about how you became the owner of a downtown building and what you've done with it since then?
Well, I actually ended up purchasing 2 buildings, one of which was completely rehabbed, and the other which it wasn't in nearly as bad shape, in which I was able to revitalize myself. But the one that needed the most attention, fortunately, was in much better shape than the one Mr. Beck just talked about. It had been constructed well. It was part of the downtown structures that were built in the late 19th century. It was 3 layers of brick thick on the sides and on the front. However, the roof trusses had failed, and so they'd been propped up with 4x4 posts and so on and so forth. And when the contractor took me in, the contractor that we ended up using took me in the first time, he said, "Now don't slam the door because the roof may fall down." But I was able to put together a number of possibilities. I got in on the last round of what turned out to be federal FEMA flood money from 2008. And so it was an upper story rehabilitation into apartments. And then downstairs, I was able to get a matching grant from Iowa Economic Development that was matched with tax incentive funds, TIF funds from the city. And with monies of my own, then we were able to rehab the building. And so it's a success story. But I started out with a much better building than the one Mr. Beck just talked about, built out of 2x4s and asbestos.
And your building is finished now. You've rehabbed
Yes.
it. How do you?
Yes, it is. It has. I didn't want to see another pocket park in downtown Iowa Falls, and yes, I've had no trouble attracting tenants to the upper story apartments. That's turned out very well. And downstairs, I have a good stable business that is in the double storefront that's there. And yeah, we've been up and running that way for 5 years now.
So Jim, I want to stick with you for just Hammond. I want to stick with you for just a minute. You know, you talk about this like, well, we got some funding from it sounds like it's all just a neat bow, all tied and very simple, but it must have been difficult. I mean, was there a point where you where the building was being rehabbed and you thought, what did I get myself into? Or, I mean, anybody who's done any work with an old building knows it's not just you start the project and there it goes.
Well, the wonderful thing was that I came into this, I have advanced degrees, but not in building rehabilitation. And so I was able to surround myself and everyone in the city, the Main Street program, the city council, Iowa Economic Development, SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Office, all of those people came together and they said, oh, we've got a newbie here that isn't quite sure how this all works. And they were very, very helpful in guiding me through these things. And so now in retrospect, yeah, there were days when I was terribly worried, but it wasn't to walk through the park, but still from the technical assistance network grant that I got to survey the building up through all of the different Region 6 planning with Marty Weimar and just many, many things. It all came together and I just was very fortunate.
So the next question is for all three of you. We've talked about all of the work that it takes to inspect and obtain a building and fix a building. Some people would say, why don't you just knock it down and build a new building that better serves our needs today? Is there something to be gained? And if so, what is it by building new? And what do we lose when we lose these buildings in our towns? Jump in, whoever wants to.
There's some great examples of architecture in the small towns around the squares, and for me, I enjoy that. I've owned an old building as well and an old house as well, and I enjoy seeing the something that's deteriorated brought back to life, and that's my goal. Of course, we do a lot of inspections for older buildings for people, and we do tell them what they're getting into. And usually it's a labor of love and not necessarily a great economic thing. And as James pointed out, there's quite a few sources of money, and that helps substantially. But it takes a lot of people, and it takes the help of the city and those other agencies to get a good project.
Well, and I'd like to say here that late 19th century buildings, and the typical example are the beautiful, beautiful courthouses that are around the state. You go into some of them, they're built exceedingly well, and they are very, very beautiful. And while they have to be rehabbed and restored from time to time, they're going to last a good long time yet. And late 19th century building practices were meant for things to stay, and the people that settled these areas, they wanted to build a lasting thing like they were used to from the different parts of Europe that many of them came from. And so that kind of very good construction and beautiful architecture is unfortunately not present in a lot of modern newly built buildings. And so I think you need to preserve that heritage.
Steve, do you want to weigh in? What do we lose when we build new, or what? I mean, new or old? What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm not a huge fan of urban sprawl and the ways that the commerce and economic centers are shifting away from the downtown. I think that in certain areas that has its place. In small town Iowa, I think that we should strive to keep the central business district vibrant and thriving. And that's what a lot of people are looking for. And like both gentlemen mentioned earlier, these buildings, a lot of them are iconic, and it's like they have their own fingerprint. They have unique features that other buildings don't. Even in our main street, there are a few buildings that are usually in the era that our main street was built, the widest a building could be is 25 feet, because that's about the longest dimension lumber that they could get to span that. We do have a couple that are the upper stories are wider because of the roof truss system that they have. But I think one of the things that's really important to know about historic buildings is they belong to history. They don't belong to whoever has them now is just renting them, and they ought to be stewarding them through time, because if someone comes along and they do not take care of a building properly, it will not take long for that thing to start. I mean, I have a saying, it's not based in any kind of data other than my own observations, but I say, every year that a building doesn't have climate control in it, especially during the winter time, it probably loses 5 years off of its life, because the moisture in the air, the plaster starts to crack, the mortar starts to crack, and then you have fissures through, and it just magnifies the problems over and over again. Having a historic building, historic community is a lifestyle, and it's a commitment. And I've had historic homes in the past. I've been in charge of historic buildings, and I'm all in when it comes to that. And it is a huge commitment, especially when it comes to retrofitting things into modern ADA compliance standards and things like that. Some of the things can be grandfathered in, but it just takes a lot of creativity to make that happen.
All right. So Belle Plaine do you think over time the community has done a good job of preserving its buildings? And you talked a little bit about the depot earlier, and the commitment to that building and wanting to preserve it. Do you feel that's a community-wide commitment that people have?
Yeah, I believe so. I'll go back to the King Theater. The person that bought the King Theater also bought the depot, and we met with Debbie Durham, who is the economic development director for Iowa, and Jim Thompson and some of her other staff. They are invaluable, and they are people that truly want to help preserve these things, because they're the only one of their kind. This one in Belle Plaine, the depot, is a 2-story classical revival. I don't even know if there are any others left in the state, and it's in outstanding condition, and I can't wait to get going on it. I have told people that I would consider my career a failure if I don't have that thing restored by the time my career is through. And I hope that within the next 5 years, we're going to have that thing open. And I can't recall exactly what your question was, or if I answered that. But
well, mostly I was trying to get at the commitment of the community. I think,
yeah.
Is there support to preserve these buildings? And because it feels like in everything that you've said, and some of what Jim Hammond was saying, that it's not a one person thing, and it's not even just a one community thing. Like, you have to get buy-in, and you have to get help from outside also.
Right. You have to have a broad base of support from your community, or you ought to. That's a huge step. And outreach is good. I really enjoy doing pop-ups in the depot, or things, especially, and it started during COVID. I would just unlock the depot, slide the freight doors open and just put on Facebook on the historic sites, hey, we're going to open the depot up from 1 to 4 today, bring a mask because it's dusty. And dozens of people would show up, 60, 70, 80 people from all over the place. I would just announce it in the morning and people would come and just kind of scavenge around and look through the building. And the man that owned it at the time really got a kick out of that because he was the man that saved it from falling down. He put the roof on it and tuck pointed it, and he just got to a point where he couldn't do anything anymore. The community buy-in helps because oftentimes the city has to have skin in the game. The community has to have skin in the game to, one, for matching funds for grants. And you can stack so many grants, meaning you can get like a catalyst grant through the state. That's usually up to $100,000. You could get historic tax credits, brownfield, grayfield, TIF. You could TIF tax increment finance part of it. Workforce housing tax credits. There are a number of things you can do, but you have to be strategic about how you do it. And community support definitely drives that because especially if you'd have to do a bond issue or something to do an entire main street like we had to do, you definitely have to have everybody on board.
Jim Tomatich, I wanted to talk with you because you go into so many of these buildings that we're talking about, maybe the issues that the other two gentlemen have mentioned you've seen before, but are you seeing, I mean, when you talked about, your typical small towns and the county seats, are you seeing that are most of these buildings built the same way? Are they facing the same kinds of issues? And also, how fixable are they? Is it worth all this money that we're putting into it?
Yeah, and we talked before a little bit about if you let a building go, there's a lot of bad things that happen, and the other gentleman spoke about that as well. But if you let it go too long and you have to demolish it, which happens quite a bit, then you have what we call a missing tooth in your smile. And there's so many beautiful downtown areas that really look nice because the cities have enjoined with the people and tried to take care of them. And so when we go in and we take a look, either for individual owners or for cities or whoever, we evaluate how much of the structure can be saved. And then we do a list of priorities. And most of the time the structures can be saved, but there are some times where there isn't a whole lot of other choice than to do the demolition. But as the other guy spoke, it takes the city, it takes an individual, and it takes the whole community behind it to make it work. And we have a lot of towns that have good success stories, some towns with not as good success stories.
Could you talk about a couple? I mean, we have Iowa Falls and Belle Plaine represented here, but I know that you go into a lot of towns. Could you give us a little taste of some of the success stories?
Sure. We've worked quite a bit with Jefferson. We've worked quite a bit with Ames. We've worked quite a bit with Bloomfield. We've worked quite a bit with Albia. All of them have great buildings. We probably worked with, give or take, 20 different municipalities that, again, they have a group of people. Perry has a group called the Nudgers, and they've done quite a bit of restoration recently. Of course, they had the derecho come through and a mini tornado, and so some of that you get some insurance money, which helps out. But it just takes a lot of people that care, and that's the whole thing. The city council can help by giving some money to the individual groups. Jefferson had a building administrator that really cared about the old buildings and tried to help the people get the money. Bloomfield as well has a city manager that she's helped get together different grants for people, and also strongly recommended that they do the inspections. And basically from the inspection, what happens with the older buildings, we talked a little bit about that before, is that they're all built the same way. They've all got common walls that go in between them. They've got parapets on top of them, and that's to keep fire from jumping from one to the other. And then they also have what's called fire cut joists, which are diagonal joists. So if the inside of the building burns, it all collapses inward. And those are pretty consistent details, and we've got ways to fix all of them that go wrong. And so that's part of mainly what we do, is we teach people how to fix the buildings, and then they, the city and other people, help them get the resources to do so.
So what, I mean, you mentioned having city leaders who are involved, but what if you are not a leader in your community? You're not on the city council, you're not the city manager, but you see a need in your community, or you see a building that you don't think anyone is addressing. I mean, what's the next step? And that could be for any of you. I mean, Jim Hammond, your answer may be to buy the building and fix it up, but what do you do? Do you get a group of people together and say, we really want to save this building, or what's the next step?
And I can partially answer that.
Yeah.
I did that in Boone. I was from Boone, lived in Boone for a long time originally, and there was myself and two other contractors that got together because we each needed office space, and we bought a building. It was kind of remodeled, and that means that they tore the whole first floor. They completely gutted and modernized, so we couldn't get any historic grants or anything like that. But it was we called it the 1916 building. It was the Oddfellows building, and the Oddfellows is a group like the Masons and some other groups, and there's probably 50 or so Oddfellow buildings in the Midwest, and you can always see they have the emblem IOOF, which is International Order of the Oddfellow. And we did the one in Bloomfield, and it happened to be the first one in the state. And so there's anyway, they have some neat. It was a 3-story building. We ended up fixing 2 stories of it up and using it for our office space, and that was a great thing to do. But it was mostly because all of us cared about the building.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
Right.
The building that I eventually purchased and so forth had actually been vacant for several years. A wonderful early woman entrepreneur started a women's clothing concern back in the 1970s. And she worked there and ran the shop until she was 96 years old. And eventually, at that age, felt that she could just no longer do it. And so I ended up purchasing the building from her heirs from the estate. And so that's one of the reasons that it had deteriorated as far as it had, was that in her later years, she simply had to defer maintenance, and also then it had taken. But building interest in there were people in Iowa Falls who thought, oh, well, and on city council who thought, well, this was not something that was so important, and the building didn't need to be saved and things like that. But there was another group who back in the 1990s had a survey done of the entire city and had the downtown become a historical district, and it was on the National Register for Historic Preservation. And so this kind of work that was done by my predecessors way before I even knew about Iowa Falls was so very important, because my building ended up being one of the contributing buildings to the historic district. And so there were a lot of hoops I didn't have to jump through to prove that this building was worth saving in the eyes of SHPO and the Iowa Economic Development, and many townspeople who and city council members. So yes, you need to build community support.
Right. So I wanted to talk, we've been talking a lot about downtown buildings and main streets, but there are more than those kinds of buildings. There are other, like there are old schoolhouses, and there are there are barns that are being restored. So do any of you have, I mean, would any of you be willing to talk about some of the resources that are available for that, or stories that you've heard, or efforts that are underway for buildings like that?
Is anyone else having any audio issues?
We are trying to figure out what that is.
Okay. I thought it was just me.
Nope. Okay. You can all hear me still?
I can.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
The sound went away from me. No, now it came back. I'm wondering if
Jim Hammond, I wonder if that sound, is there something on your end that's making a noise?
No, it's all very quiet here, and I'm hearing and seeing people perfectly.
Okay. All right. Well, we have our tech host is going to try to get that figured out.
Do you want me to try to mute myself and keep that down?
Yeah, we'll try to get it figured out here.
Okay. Tell me to go to.
All right. It may have been Jim's audio. All right. Well, I can repeat that question. I was just asking about buildings other than Main Street buildings, but old schoolhouses in towns that maybe have built a new one, or where they've consolidated school districts, or rural buildings. Jim Tomatich, I don't know if you've had any experience with those kinds of buildings.
Yes, we have, and there's been quite a few of them, and I'll try not to talk too much, but the probably one of the nicer ones we did is in Stewart, the Basilica there. I think it's the only basilica west of the Mississippi, and it was burned out by a person that didn't like religious buildings or people. And fortunately, the exterior stonework was saved, and the city took that over, and they put a city building there, a city administrative building, or for the community building is a better word for it. And that turned out really cool. We actually had one of the Tomatich Engineering's Christmas parties there, and it was a lot of fun. And it was really neat to see an old the basilica completely rebuilt. It looks magnificent today. And it's one of those good examples of buildings that just are no longer built that way. And it turned out great. We've also done a stone house in rural Winterset that was built in the 1840s, and an individual bought it and wanted to restore it and got some state money to do that. And so there's the one in Stewart, they got both city and state money to do that. And we've also worked with, for example, the depot buildings in small towns. Mingo has a depot building we worked with, and they've got quite a bit of state and federal money, and it's right on the bike trail in Midwest or in central Iowa here. And now it's a little restaurant along the bike trail, and everybody really enjoys stopping there. And so there's a ton of old buildings that, if you can find a significant use for them, that can be restored and really can be gems along the Iowa highways and bikeways and things like that. So we're excited to do those. We've done quite a few. We'd like to do more.
So we've talked about a lot of these buildings, or a lot of the buildings we've talked about, and I don't want to exclude larger cities, but we've focused a lot on smaller towns. And I wondered, most of Iowa's small towns are not growing in population, and they don't have a lot of money left over at the end of budgeting to devote to these things. So Steve, you may be able to talk to this, but as our small towns either remain the same size or get smaller, or even if they do grow, it might be 15 people over the course of a couple of years. Is this going to take more of a concerted effort from these communities to fund projects like this, or is this one of those things that might have to go by the wayside when budgets get tighter?
Excuse me. Yeah, I think the commitment to historic buildings is a cultural thing in a community. And for instance, I keep going back to the King Theater because these are the projects that are going on right now. And right next to it's a building called the Moore Building. And the theater is something that everybody in this town has experienced in their lifetime because it's been in operation for 93 years. And Belle Plain's a regional hub in our area. So people come from all over the place. They have, we're about a hour away from Iowa City, Cedar Rapids, Waterloo, Grinnell, about an hour, 15 minutes away from Des Moines in the Quad Cities. But it's a unique little town. And the King Theater by far, in my opinion, has been the most popular, and it's just getting started. Is that me?
Nope.
Okay. But other buildings like the depot that is gearing up to go, not very many people have experiences with that. So on social media, when activities happen at the King Theater, they basically go viral for rural Iowa. You know, they get hundreds or thousands of likes and shares and stuff, which is about as viral as you can get in a rural community. But you know, there are people that just say we'd be better off if we just bulldozed it from one end to the other and put in, you know, a strip mall or something. And I just don't agree with that outlook for the central business district.
Yeah. We did get a question from someone who's joining us here. She wondered, are there developers out there that are passionate about and interested in purchasing these old downtown buildings in small town Iowa for restoration? Maybe not somebody who's homegrown, but who from the outside says, wow, I drive through this town, or I've been to this town, and I think this is such a beautiful building. Have either of you or any of you heard about someone like that, or is that something that happens?
If I may, we have multiple people from the coasts that moved in because the barriers to entry in rural Iowa for buying a building and starting a business are very low, and the dollar goes very far in a rural community. And so the grant funding, $100,000 grant in Cedar Rapids doesn't get you might get a master plan out of that. But in Belle Plaine, you can rehabilitate 2 entire apartments almost for that amount of money and create a living space for people that's affordable. And we have had a lot of people that have some kind of a tie to the community, a great grandson, or there's just some kinship, or someone that lived in Chicago and they came and visited their uncle in the summer and they just loved it and they wanted to move back because it essentially never changed, for good or bad, but they can replicate the good feels they had when they were younger and have a bookstore or a coffee shop and have little to no overhead.
We have had quite a few of those. We've had 3 or 4. I remember one in Bloomfield that people from the West Coast moved back. A lot of people know the story about the Hotel Pate in Perry. That was a gal from California that also came back and wanted to do something for her community, and that's a beautiful restoration of the hotel there, and it's still open for business. But and then we have quite a few developers in the Des Moines area that are willing to take that risk, but it's harder to find the smaller towns simply because the rents aren't necessarily there to support what money you have to put into it. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, but again, it usually takes somebody with, let's say, extended resources to do that in a small town.
Yes. It might be cheaper than a big city, but there's still some cost to it.
Right.
We've talked a lot about 100-plus-year-old buildings. But I'm wondering about the buildings that aren't that old yet, that maybe we say, yeah, that building's in great shape. It's 50 or 60 years old. And so we're not focused on that. But should we be focusing on that? What should we be doing to make sure that we don't end up in this position just continuously as these buildings age? Like, what should our communities be doing?
Well, I guess I could answer that. we do deal with a lot of buildings, and to understand, people like to build buildings that are maintenance free, and I can guarantee there's no such thing. Your building is always going to need maintenance. It needs to be cleaned. It needs to be all the caulk joints and everything. Buildings move in Iowa. We have a 120-degree variation in temperatures that makes buildings expand and contract. We have humidity, we have hail, wind, rain, all of that. and building materials will deteriorate. Again, the rate of deterioration is the most important, and you can slow down the rate of deterioration, but you always need to maintain your building. And so, yes, you're correct. The buildings built 50 years ago are going to typically start needing maintained when they're 25, give or take, years old. And we do a lot of school buildings, for example, but a lot of building owners that have buildings of that age don't like to put money in their buildings. They usually want to take it out. And that becomes a problem. And that's what starts the deterioration process. It gets accelerated. But you do need to put new roofs on, depending on the type of roof, every give or take 25 years. Even masonry buildings need maintained, tuck pointed, sealed, cleaned, that type of thing. Windows need replaced every give or take 25 years. So there is a lot of maintenance, and hopefully the building owners will keep up with it, but it doesn't always happen.
Steve, I wonder, go ahead. I don't want to interrupt you.
No, you're fine. I was just going to say time, gravity, and water will flatten anything with, you know, that humans construct. And it is imperative that they be maintained. We have like a mid-century medical facility that the city owns, and it was renovated in maybe the 80s or something. And I was just in there last night with a developer just saying, hey, you know, we can take this back down and, you know, remove the drop ceiling and take it back to the big exposed beams and beautiful architecture that's just hidden. And you know, it's like when you buy an old house and there's carpet everywhere and you're like, oh my gosh, and you peel it back and there's a little bit of hardwood floor and you're like, why would anybody cover this? And you rip it out and it's like, thanks for carpeting that so you preserve this floor. So, you know, the bones are still there. But I think it is really important. And you know, after the derecho, we were very thoughtful about how we renovated things, especially like that medical facility on the outside, to be so that the renovation is informed by the period as often as we possibly can.
And so from a city perspective, do you have an inspector in the city? How are you checking on the buildings in Belle Plaine? How are you making sure that they're being maintained in a way that they don't become a danger?
That's a great question. So there are things that I would like to get to. My career got off to a slow start because I had COVID and then the derecho and then a number of other catastrophes. So I haven't been able to get as proactive about things as I like, but and we have, you know, 130-year-old infrastructure system. But one of the things that other communities do that I would like to implement is doing like a downtown building inventory, and annual, or you know, every couple of years, just go in and have it inspected top to bottom. And you know, a lot of these shared walls, party walls, when you do have a building torn down in between and you have a tooth missing, those buildings weren't built to be exposed to the elements. They were built to be the inside of another building. So some people solved that with stucco or things like that. Some people spray foamed the side of them. I see that. That was a popular thing here for a while, and that's hard to undo. But I kind of forgot your question.
I just wondered, how do you, as a city, make sure that the buildings aren't becoming dangerous, that someone's paying attention to, you know, especially if the owner's not having it inspected, or if it's a vacant building that no one's going into, maybe you don't see those problems. I
try to be as vigilant as I can be, because we don't have a large staff and we don't have a ton of people that are committed to the old buildings on staff. And I'm certainly not an expert like these other gentlemen, but I'm trying to pick up the torch where these guys, you know, have them hand me the torch when they, you know, at the end of their careers, so that I can learn from them, and I talk to older folks and try to get information from them, tribal knowledge. We were fortunate that, you know, when I was a kid is when shopping malls were popping up everywhere and downtown started to die, and they really did some weird things with awnings and try to make it look more like a mini mall. We removed all of that stuff with the downtown renovation. At one time, when about 20 years ago, there were maybe 6 or 8 businesses open on our main street out of 60 maybe. And now we have maybe a half a dozen that are not occupied. And some of those are being renovated at the moment. So I would say that the majority of the people after that historic downtown renovation bought into that and bought the buildings. And, you know, oftentimes, you know, you can get a grant for $250,000 to redo the facade of a building that has a valuation of $30,000. And then you put $300,000 into the building and the valuation is now $65,000. As an example, I mean, I'm not trying to be dramatic, but I mean, that definitely.
It's accurate, right?
But that's what it costs to get the job done correctly.
Yeah. So Jim Hammond, I had a question for you. You know, we were talking about maintenance of buildings, ongoing maintenance, and you know, we've talked about you fixed up your building and it's beautiful and it's occupied now and it's a part of Main Street, but what is the ongoing maintenance like? Because it's still an old building and I'm assuming you still have to do work, but what does that look like for you now? Obviously the work's not done.
Well, I've been very lucky. I've been on the honeymoon phase because all of the infrastructure was redone. New furnaces, new electrical system, new plumbing, all of that kind of new lighting. However, I have noticed now it's time for me to repaint the facade again. We've just done it, seems like yesterday. But the salt and sidewalk maintenance stuff during the winter has taken its toll, and I see that there's paint that's peeled and things like that. So it's something that needs to be attended to on a regular basis. And there are public areas of the buildings, hallways and stairways and things like that that need to be swept and vacuumed and maintained, and I am remiss in doing that right at the moment, and so I need to remind myself that next week I need to see that that's taken care of, and washing windows and that kind of thing. There's a roof garden on the back of my building where it goes from being 2-story to 1-story, and that needs some attention. So that, yes, there are things that need to be done, or you end up being back in the kind of condition you were before you first, or when the building was unrestored.
Yeah. So we only have a few minutes left here, but I want to, for anybody who's joined us today and is interested in these, in restoring buildings, either in their own town or pushing for, I mean, what's the best advice that each of you could give them? And Jim Tomatich, I'll start with you. If I'm not putting you on the spot too much, but what's your advice to someone, and where can they go, or what should they be doing to start this?
Yeah, the first thing is to find a use. And I've been a landlord before, and I've been, so I understand that, you know, you have to make a budget, you have to make things work. Once you find a use, you can evaluate how much money you're going to be able to make off of it. And then you decide if you do want to actually make money or if you want it as a labor of love. And that basically gives you a budget to start with. Once you have a budget, you need to prioritize what repairs need to be done. And again, that's where you hire a professional. I go in and evaluate the building, and I will tell you what needs to be done structurally. If you need a new roof, if you need a new foundation, if you can repair the walls and how to do that, and that gives you a budget for that. I don't do the mechanical, electrical, or some of the other things, and that. But once you can figure out what needs to be done, find a good use for it, and with COVID, a lot of people ended up starting to work at home, and that's one of the neat things about that is that if there's anything good that came out of COVID, people learned how to work out of home or learned to work remotely. And now you can work in a small town in Iowa and work for a big corporation. And so there's great opportunities there for if you want to live in a small town, to get an old building, fix it up, run retail in the lower level, and residential in the upper level, and a lot of people can use it as a live and work type building, and that's a popular thing to do. So my advice then would be to get it inspected properly, identify what needs to be done, get accurate estimates on how much it costs, and then decide how to go forward.
And probably start to enlist people who are supportive of you.
Right.
Build some kind of
build relationships with the city council, the city people, city administrator, and then also have them help you get what grants are available to make it more economically feasible.
Yeah. Steve Beck, what advice would you have for somebody who has listened to all this today and is ready to go out and take action?
Sure. So if you're a city official, I would highly recommend that if you have local option sales tax or some type of discretionary revenue stream, that you would put a little bit away for economic development grants for your community. So we have business incentive grants that are 1/3 match up to $4,500. That's not a lot, but we can give out a lot of them, and that's seed money for people to get grants. I would most definitely talk to an engineer right away, a trusted engineer, do your homework, and talk with the city development director, if there is one, or a county development director, your city administrator, and be ready to talk about your dreams. And that's what people do all the time with me, is they come to me with their hopes and dreams, and they have an idea, and then it's my job to try to partner them with a building owner or a building that could be for sale. And then also at the same time, try to help them get involved with a business manager. So, if a person is wanting to start a business, maybe their partner works and commutes and they have insurance and all the benefits, and the other partner wants to stay in the hometown so they can be with the kids and just have a little shop. Look around and see what other things are going on. And if you talk to the city or talk to the economic development director in the area, you'll know maybe what other things are happening. So if you want to start a coffee shop, there might be 2 other people that are trying to start a coffee shop or a brewery or a Mexican restaurant, or that happens here a lot. And so we have to try to help choose the person that's going to be the most successful with it. And we certainly don't try to alter anybody's destiny, but certain people would probably be more prone to success, and you wouldn't want to have 3 of something in a small town unless you have a lot of tourism, and just to work it in, and like Mr. Tomatich said, is just see how that fits into the business district, and make sure that you can have some kind of projections on what your revenue stream might be. And definitely, if you don't have a local economic development person, then talk with maybe your local COG, like we are in the ECOG realm here in eastern Iowa, most of us, or make a contact to the state and Iowa Economic Development Authority, and they will help you get where you want to go, because that's their whole deal, is trying to help you get into business.
All right. We are at Jim Hammond. I was going to give you a chance to weigh in. Let me see, you're muted here. Let's see if we can unmute you. Oh, and of course, we're having a little bit of technical difficulties. But we're right at the end of time. I've so enjoyed this conversation. Oh, here, Jim, do you want to give just a couple of seconds best advice?
Networking. Go on the computer and look at the website for Iowa Economic Development and also for State Historical Society, the SHPO office, and and don't forget all of the local grant organizations and endowments that are right in your community and actually give away a pretty good chunk of money. And so those things.
All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone for joining us on this panel discussion today. Thanks to our panelists, especially for sharing all of your knowledge and your time and being very generous with both. Thanks to our sponsor, ITC Midwest. The next session will begin at 2:25. If you stick with economic development, it is coming together for the greater good, which will be a discussion about the ways that Iowa communities have worked together to find creative solutions to challenges, which I think I might actually tune into. It sounds really interesting. But thank you so much. And thanks for joining us on Iowa Ideas.
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.